Welcome. Great to see you all here. I'm Terry Martin. I'm a modern Russian historian here at Harvard, and I'll be chairing today's session. And what we'll do is I'll introduce the speakers. They'll give their talks, Tom and Nina first, and then Sergey will respond. And then we will have...
Sergey first.
Oh, Sergey first, and then Tom and... oh, okay. All right.
And then we will respond.
And then we'll have some questions. Right. Sergey Plokhy, you all know. He is the Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and the director of the Ukrainian Institute here, my friend and colleague. And he has had sort of two scholarly careers in some ways that have overlapped. He was an early modern Ukrainianist who worked on religion and national identity in modern, pre-modern and modern Ukraine. And then about 20 years ago, he took up the study of the Cold War and Soviet history based upon episodes that occurred in Ukraine. About the collapse of Ukraine, he wrote a recent award-winning book about Chernobyl and a book, The Last Empire, on the months before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Work on Stepan Bandera's murder. But now a pair of books on the World War II and the end of the Grand Alliance. His first book was on the Yalta Conference, and that's when it's sort of the what you've all heard about. The Yalta Conference is probably one of the more famous events of the early Cold War, and in fact, we tend to attribute to Yalta all kinds of things that didn't happen at Yalta even, that happened at Potsdam or San Francisco or Tehran or not at the conference at all. Now he's written a companion book that talks about something that most people haven't heard about, the American airmen who were stationed in the Soviet Union for part of World War II. Sergey will talk about that first, and then we will hear from Thomas Holtzman, whose father served on that base. Thomas is has been a government attorney for most of his career, working first at the Labor Department and then for 25 years at the Federal Deposit Insurance Company. He has a BA in Modern European History from Amherst, and he got his JD from the University of Pennsylvania. Then we'll hear from Nina Tumarkin, who is a professor of Russian history at Wellesley and a associate of the Davis Center for now well nigh a half century, one of our perhaps our longest serving now. Priscilla McMillan is still the pride place. She's written several books on Soviet history. She wrote a book about the Lenin cult, Lenin Lives, and then a book about World War II, The Living and the Dead, the rise and fall of the cult of World War II. She's currently working on a book on the politics of the past in Putin's Russia. So the rise again of the cult of World War II, and she will speak after that. So now I'll hand over the mic to Sergey Plokhy.
Thank you, Terry, for this introduction, and I would like to thank the Historian Seminar that co-sponsors that event and the two centers that organized it, the Davis Center and Chris. I'm not sure where Chris is. Thanks, Chris. Okay. And the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and Christina, who was most involved in organizing of that event, is here. So it's really my pleasure to speak here and to bring the results of my research of the previous year to the community of the two centers, but to Harvard in general, because as you will find out in me looking at the KGB archives in Kiev and researching the history of Poltava and Mirgorod, I eventually ended up looking at some of the materials in the Davis Center archive and finding connections between that part of the story and including the story related to my life and the Harvard story. Terry already mentioned that I have written on the Yalta conference before that, and I really enjoyed the experience. One of the reasons why I wrote about that, it was interesting for me as a child to find out that in Crimea, when I was going for vacation, that at some point there was the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Britain, and that was in the middle of the Cold War, and I thought how in the world it could happen. And of course they wouldn't let us to go to the Yusupov Palace where Stalin was staying at that time. So to a degree out of that interest grew came that book, and then it was a major discovery also for me when I realized that it wasn't just a short visit by the American president, that for a longer period of time, more than 1,200 Americans were stationed on the permanent basis in the cities of Poltava, Mirgorod, and Pryatin. So I was really very interested in that story. Another reason for interest was that with my work on the Yalta conference, I looked at the way how the history was made at the very top, and what I really lacked to see how the decisions that are made at the very top, how they affect developments on the ground, how they affect people who really fight that war. And this new project really allowed me to do both, to look at the people at the top, like Joseph Stalin and others, and the way how the decisions of the big commanders, political leaders affected people like those GIs, but also how what they did really helped to shape the war and influence the decisions made at the very top. So what brought the Americans to those three towns in Ukraine in the spring of 1944 was the really idea that came out of the American Air Force. The Americans were seriously looking forward to what became known as D-Day, and one of the preconditions for successful landing was the complete control of the skies. And to do that, they had to destroy Luftwaffe, and destroy Luftwaffe meant not just shooting down the airplanes in the air, but also destroying the oil supplies and oil refineries and the factories where the Luftwaffe built its planes. And a lot of that was in Eastern Germany or in Eastern Europe. And the Americans had wonderful, let me see, airplanes, yes, the B-17 Flying Fortresses, but they lacked in 1943 the fighters that could have enough gasoline, would have able to fly all the way to Eastern Europe and then come back to the bases either in Britain or in Italy. And they came up with this idea of shuttle bombing. What if the airplanes would be flying to Eastern Europe, bombing those targets in Poland, in Romania, in Hungary, land on the Soviet territory, refuel, get new ammunition, and then fly back. And on the top of that, they thought that that would be a great opportunity to show to the Soviets what great allies they were, because the Grand Alliance was a very strange alliance in which the Western and Eastern allies, they fought the same war, but different battles and different fronts. And really the only exception to that story, where both the Americans and the Soviets fought side by side was the story of this Poltava and Belgorod air bases. So that was really very interesting for me to look at how the alliance worked on the ground, and that was really the only place where I could look at. And then came a wonderful discovery that in the KGB archives there were tons and tons of documents on those air bases, because the history of the air bases was relatively known from the American side. A number of books were written based on the American military archives. What we didn't really know was the Soviet part of the story, and that's what those archives in those files in the SBU former KGB archives in Kiev provided in a major way. So there were two types of institutions that were involved in surveilling the Americans, and the first one was it was called Smersh Spionem, so the military counterintelligence unit. And another was the People's Commissariat for State Security. And the People's Commissariat for State Security was monitoring the local population. And the military counterintelligence was involved with what was happening in the army. And that was, that's what you expect. You have military counterintelligence, and that's what they're doing. There was one caveat in the sense that the Smersh was created really with fighting with the German spies, or the fighting the German penetration into the Soviet rear. What the Smersh was put in charge of doing at that point is actually spying on the Allies. And they did that quite successfully. So we have numerous reports. We know about Americans from those archives, what they thought, what their expectations were, more than we can actually learn from the military archives here in the U.S., because the people who were reporting for the U.S. were more interested in bombs and the number of flights and so on and so forth. They were less interested in what those people thought or how they reacted to the D-Day or other things. The question is, of course, what do you do with that, and how you evaluate that, how reliable those sources were, and that was the question that I decided really on the case by case basis. You also find in the secret police archives, especially in the Soviet ones, a lot of stuff that, again, you think it's better for you not to read that and not to know about that. So I was trying to be also as sensitive as I could in terms of what I was writing about. But again, the big picture, the big question was, okay, whether it's reliable or not, and if it's important for the overall story for understanding what it is happening, it was going in the book. Otherwise, it was not. I have, as all of us, limited amount of time. So what I will do with the remaining time, I'll tell you a few words really about my expectations and about my overall conclusion, and then I will walk you through the photographs that I have that come from a variety of sources, and I'll tell you something about those sources. But they will also tell the story of those air bases, and will help to explain you why I arrived to that set of conclusions and not to another. So when I started the research, I was interested, as I already told you, in how the alliance really looked from below, what really did it mean. And I had kind of a hypothesis that, yeah, probably they were fighting together and things were working, but as all of us today, we are interested in issues of culture and cultural history, and I suspected that there would be some kind of cultural misunderstandings and clashes, and I thought, okay, it would be really interesting to find what they were. And to my surprise, I didn't find much of the per se cultural clashes and misunderstandings. For a number of reasons. One of those reasons was that a lot of people who were pre-selected and who stayed on the bases, not the pilots who were going back and forth, they went through a particular screening in a sense. On the one hand, the authorities were interested in people who knew languages and had some background in the region. On the other hand, they didn't want anyone who would be considered to be anti-Soviet. And they ended up with a fair amount of people who really had roots in the background, and their families had that background in the region. They would be with Russian, Jewish, Ukrainian, sometimes Polish background. So the kind of a cultural clash that I expected really never happened there. But I found something different. I found that almost all of them who come to Poltava and come to those air bases, they come with really very high expectations. They're really very excited about the mission. They keep in high regard the Soviets. This is happening after Stalingrad and after Kursk. So they're not anti-Soviet by any stretch of imagination. And I'm talking about maybe 95%, but there are all sorts of exceptions as well. And then by the time they leave, and they leave at different times, some of them in the fall of 1944, others in May and June of 1945, more or less the same proportion, 95 towards 5 or 10%, would actually live to be sworn enemies of the regime. And some of them, and I follow that, not all of them, but some of them become really key figures in the Cold War that starts at that time. They had an experience already of dealing with the Soviets. And once I saw that trajectory, the question was why, and I had to maybe fine-tune a little bit or change my hypothesis. So culture was still there, but it wasn't culture in these broader terms. But most of that was about the political culture. Very, very many of them were, again, quite not some sympathetic, but most of them not particularly antagonistic toward the socialism and socialist experiment that was happening in the Soviet Union. Some of them had the background, family background that were to the left. Others didn't have that background, but living through the depression of the 1930s knew that, okay, maybe not everything is absolutely okay and fine with the capitalist system, so they were open-minded in that sense. And I don't think that changed much. But what changed was actually absolutely rejection of the police state, the way how they experienced the Stalinism in those spaces, the policy of surveillance, the policy of official policy of lying on a number of things, the absolute lack of freedom to discuss anything dealing with politics. They were forced occasionally, without knowledge of language and so on and so forth, to march to the Great October Soviet Socialist Revolution celebrations and stand there on the Platz for hours and hours. Not sure what they were doing that and why that was necessary. So at the end, I agreed with one of the participants of those events who wrote his memoirs much later, that what they witnessed at those air bases in Ukraine was really the beginning of the Cold War. And in terms of the clash of political cultures that was never really overcome, that's assessment I think is at least I share that assessment. And now I will walk you through the images and also make a connection that I talked about at the very beginning. This is connection between the Americans in the steppes of Ukraine and Harvard studies of the Soviet Union and how they connected in terms of the individual histories and trajectories of people. So this is the part of the world where the Americans landed. A photograph comes from the collection of Franklin Holtzman, father of Tom Holtzman, and we'll talk about that later. The area devastated by the war. First there was the front moving eastward, then westward. Different estimates, but the 60–70% of the population, women, children, and elderly. So women are overrepresented in that population that they encounter there. That's how the Americans and the Soviets look like. The idea is here, the original idea of the shuttle bombing is that they get new ammunition and then get new bombs on the return flights back to Britain and to Italy. The first General weeks, and that was April and May and June of 1944, were quite happy time. There was excitement on both sides. But then came something that was unexpected. In June, on the 22nd of June of 1944, the Luftwaffe raid destroys dozens of American airplanes on the airfield in Poltava. And the Americans are shocked. They call it, one of the chapters in my book is called Pearl Harbor on the Steppes. And these are the worst losses that Air Force suffered on the ground since Pearl Harbor. So that was, well, again, it wasn't Pearl Harbor in terms of the number of those planes that were lost, but it was quite a shock. And the expectations were that the Soviets were there to protect them. The Soviets tried their best. They couldn't. They didn't have the radar equipment on their fighter planes, so during the night raid they really couldn't do much. They were firing, the flak was there, they didn't hit one single German airplane, so that was a huge embarrassment for the Soviets. The tensions were already there before, but now they got into the open. By that time also the second front was already in Germany and, in France. And that was a very important also turning point in the sense that Stalin and Molotov, important characters in my book, they actually didn't want those bases to start with. They didn't want the Americans on their territory, they didn't want the American bases on their territory, they looked at that with suspicion, and the main reason why they did that because they wanted to be nice to the Allies. They wanted the second front. So it's part of the same story why they dissolved the Comintern in 1943, why they allowed the re-election of the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, really. So once the second front was there, they're not really interested. The attack on June 22nd, this is a huge embarrassment. The front line by that time actually moves further to the west, and the Soviets, it was interesting for me to find that out in terms of strategic thinking about the war. At that point, they didn't have strategic aviation, they didn't understand the importance of the strategic bombing. Aviation was normally working and functioning in support of the ground troops along the front lines. So they also conceptually were not getting it, why this is important and how that can be helpful. So all of these reasons come together and result in really kicking out the Americans from the air bases after all sorts of ways of sending the signal that the Americans were not welcome anymore. So there would be datings with the local women, and the pairs would be attacked. Those local women would be attacked by either officers of the Red Army or someone in plain clothes. So there would be fights and so on and so forth through July and August. And then the last kind of a trigger that forced that exodus was that Roosevelt wrote to Stalin saying, okay, we understand that for this and that reason you can't help the Poles in Warsaw in the middle of uprising, but allow us to do that. Can we land on the Poltava base and the Mirhorod base and actually try to resupply the Poles from those bases? And the answer was no. And that was turning point in attitude toward the Soviet Union on part of people at the top, like Avril Harriman in Moscow, who was very much involved in that. But that was also a story that was very well known to people on the bases. So most of the bases, most of people leave, but they agreed to leave a skeleton crew in Poltava to help with the air traffic between the American mission in Moscow and the embassy in Moscow and Tehran and Middle East. And those people and at the end responsible for the American air traffic to Yalta during the Yalta conference. So it was, those were people from Poltava who were in charge of this air operations at Saki. Saki airport in the Crimea, through which all the Roosevelt and 700 of members of the American delegation and a little bit less than that of British delegation were flying to the Crimea. In Yalta, they signed a very important, on the margins of the conference, a very important document that influenced what the Poltava people would be doing. And that was an agreement on the exchange of the prisoners of war. So Molotov is signing here an exchange with the British, but the same kind of agreement was signed with the Americans. And the idea was that the Red Army was moving into Europe. It was overrunning the concentration camps, German concentration camps. And among them, there were American and British and Canadian and so on and so forth prisoners. So the question was how to get them as soon as possible back to the Soviet Union. And the idea was that the Poltava was a natural place where they could be flown and then flown back to Iran or to Northern America. And that actually was a major problem because Stalin didn't want anybody to be in Western Ukraine and Eastern Poland. That's especially in Poland, that's where those concentration camps were. And that's where the prisoners of war were, because again, the Stalin was in the process of preparing the moving of the frontiers. The forced exchange of the populations was already going on, so things that were not yet agreed at Yalta were still under discussion. They were already happening on the ground. And that became a major reason for the decision eventually to close even the Poltava base, but also a major disappointment on the part of the Americans, who never really could understand how the Soviets could treat the prisoners of war the way how they were treated. And by the Soviet standards, the Soviets treated the American prisoners of war very well, because they were shooting the Soviet ones. They were traitors by definition. So the fact that they were just living them on their own without medical care or something like that was considered to be an act of humanity on the part of, at least within the political culture of Red Army. So that was one of the, again, additional moments where you see the clash of political cultures. The democracy of one of them, the ability to dating and other things, and now the different attitude toward prisoners of war. This is one of the examples of these KGB documents that I was using, signed by the Smersh commander at the base, Major Zorin, and the photograph is of the commander of the base at that time, Colonel Hampton, and report is on the arrival of the Americans into the Crimea in January of 1944 before the Yalta conference. And now the long-promised connection, something that I found in the archives that I never would think that it would lead me eventually here to Harvard. Franklin Holzman, young radar operator at that time, first at the Mirhorod, and then he moved and continued in Poltava. So he stayed in Poltava for the entire duration of his period there. His letters home were especially priceless. Again, I want to thank Tom, I want to thank family, I want to thank also Davis Center and Hiraki Kuromiya, who first alerted me to that travel document. So I signed them at liberty, and they're really very, very useful. The story of Dayton at the basis, of course, is incomplete without Franklin Holtzman and what we learned from his letters. This is a photograph coming from Mirhorod. Another figure that brought me to Harvard was George Fisher. And again, you find these names in the documents. They tell you nothing, and then you start to try to figure out whether you can find about some of them, and sometimes you get really lucky. George Fisher was the son of a pro-communist journalist, Louis Fisher, not pro-communist but leftist here in the U.S., who parked his family in the Soviet Union in the 1920s because he thought they were safe there. So George Fisher was growing up in Moscow, wanting to become Marshal Tukhachevsky. His closest friend was Marcus Wolf, whom he called Misha. And Misha then became known the super spy of the Cold War. So they were close friends, dreaming about career in the Red Army as Red Army officers. And then eventually George Fisher ends up in the U.S., of course, as the result of the Great Terror, brought to the U.S. with the help of Eleanor Roosevelt, and then serves at those bases. With George Fisher, it was interesting that I was also was able to work with his FBI file, thanks to courtesy of David Engerman and Natalia Laz. Natalia somewhere here today. Thanks for making copies of Fisher's memoirs and also his FBI file. So I was working with KGB file and FBI file, and both were suspecting poor George Fisher of spying. So that's probably the photo with which I will complete my presentation. That is when the Americans learn about the death of Roosevelt, and that's where the morale is already extremely low at the bases. They know that they're being kicked out. And that is the really last parade. So I will stop here, and I will move back to the image of Franklin Holtzman, which again comes from the family. So I'm grateful for that.
My father had hoped to write a book on his experience with his closest buddy from Poltava, Sam Chafkin. It never happened for reasons that I can only guess at, but I think we're very lucky. Serhiy has written a terrific book. We're deeply grateful that an historian of Serhiy's eminence would choose to write on this topic. And I know my father would be very pleased. I mean, he was always trying to help scholars who were interested in his experience to get information. My talk will be on what it was like to grow up with a father who had that experience in World War II. There's, I guess you could describe it as a macro and a micro aspect to it. One issue was what was it like being in the family with him, having lived through this. And the other thing was, well, what was it like being in the outside world with, trying to explain his experience to people and trying to integrate what he had done with the dominant narrative. Let me give the caveat that this is how I experienced it. My brother, who is in the audience, may have experienced the whole thing completely differently as my sister may have, but this is the way I experienced it. The macro issue really involves narrative. I was born in 1950, and during my childhood and youth, the dominant World War II narrative for the Americans was set forth in movies and books such as Guadalcanal Diary, Miracle at Midway, The Longest Day, the TV show Combat. And it was all the war in the Pacific, in North Africa, in Western Europe. The government played down Operation Frantic for political reasons having to do with the Cold War. And even today, it's almost impossible to find anybody who is not a scholar or what I would call a Poltava child who's heard of Frantic. To the extent that the Soviet war came up at all in books and films and TVs setting forth the narrative, it was in the context of German soldiers expressing the fear that if they screwed up, they'd be sent to the Russian front. I mean, I remember a scene in The Great Escape where somebody says, you know, if he screws up, Russian front. That was it. Growing up at the time I did, most of the boys that I knew, at least, were conscious of that their fathers and friends' fathers served in World War II, and most of them had at least a very basic knowledge of what their fathers did. Most kids' fathers fit easily into the dominant narrative. You know, there was a kid whose father was a Marine in the Pacific, infantry in Europe, things that were readily integratable into the narrative. Not mine. When I talked about what Dad did in World War II, most of the kids seemed puzzled, confused. Huh? His experience had little or nothing in common with the experience of their fathers. So while I knew a lot about what he had done, I was never completely comfortable explaining how he fit in. On the micro level, his war experience was sort of a constant presence in my life as a child. Most of the GIs who fought in World War II were very reluctant to talk about their war experience. You could get name, rank, and serial number out of them, and that was about it. Dad was the opposite. His experience was crucial to his life and profession, and he would talk about it at the drop of the hat. Wasn't hard to get him going. As many as those of you who know him may recall, he was a wonderful raconteur, and with the war experiences, he had an almost inexhaustible supply of interesting war stories. In addition, he would, I can still remember walking around the house muttering "Bоже moj" to himself about something or other that had happened. That means "Oh my God," or asking us to do something and saying "Пожалуйста." And Sam Chafkin, his closest buddy from Poltava, visited several times, and I remember that. So I heard lots and lots of stories growing up, a number of which are in the book. But one of the stories that will amuse those of you who knew him, that I don't think I told Sergei, and it's not in the interview, was how he was chosen for Frantic. I mean, how did my father get so lucky to get this interesting assignment that changed his life? And if you read Sergei's book, you'll find out that while there was a specific recruitment of Russian-speaking soldiers, the rest of them were just sort of taken at random from units in England. And the commanding officers would get a request to to cough up, 3 guys who were weather guys, or in the case of my father's commanding officer, they wanted 2 radar mechanics. And Serhiy also mentioned that these requests were used by the commanding officers to get rid of what Serhiy describes as troublemakers and misfits. What my father said was that the Russians sent their very best people to man these bases, and we sent our F-ups. So, those of you who knew my father are probably wondering, well, that doesn't seem right, but my father was quite left-wing in his youth, and he didn't have much use for authority, and he really didn't have much use for commanding officers, none of whom he ever got along with. And the request to his commanding officer came down for 2 radar mechanics, and the guy was clearly thinking, well, who do I need to get rid of? And a week before he had to make the decision, my father was promoted to corporal. And when the commanding officer came up and said, "Congratulations, Holzman," my father said, "No thanks to you, sir." And that was how he had chosen as a troublemaker or a misfit for Frantic. Besides the stories, the photo albums were featured on childhood. He had 2 or 3 from his war experiences, and I think 2 of them totally were Poltava and Mirgorod. And you take out the photo albums from time to time and show me or other people the photos while he was telling stories. I was unaware that the letters home existed until after his death. I don't know if David, were you aware? No. We found them after his death, so I never saw them. I also became very familiar with the photos because as a teen I learned how to do darkroom work. And he had an enormous number of black and white negatives. And by that was the 60s, we were taking slides. So the supply of negatives was what I used to learn how to use an enlarger. And incidentally, the enlarger that we had to provide a lens, so I just took one off one of the Fed cameras that he had brought home and used that. The Fed provides a good segue into the next part of my talk, which is artifacts. My father he took out a few things that he brought back from the Ukraine when he told stories, and I have some of them here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the Soviet aviator's cap that used to grace his bookshelves in his study. But I do have one of the Feds. The Fed was a copy of whatever the Leica was at that time. And the photo guys on the base decided, well, it's a copy, is it any good? Let's test it against the Leica. And they did, and the Fed was as good as the Leica. And Serhiy showed a slide, photo from the raid, the June 22nd raid. This is a piece of flak that landed next to my father during the raid. Then, another thing that my father had an almost inexhaustible supply of was this looks to you like a wad of cash. It is. My father had an enormous supply of the script, I guess you would call it, that was used during the German occupation of Ukraine. Here's an example. This is the unit of currency was a karbovanets. I have no idea how much. This is a 20 karbovanets bill. And the thing, I guess, my father was an economist, and he would take the stuff to coin dealers, and he'd say, you know, is it worth anything? They'd tell him, no, it's very, very rare, but it's not worth anything. Nobody's interested in it. So you would, you know, as an economist, I guess he was sort of amused that he would have this stuff that was very rare, but worthless. And you know, I think my brother has a pile about like this size, and between my brothers, we probably got most of the world's supply of marijuana. But I did want to spread the wealth by presenting Serhi with Svansik Karbovanets note.
Should I give it? Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm sure that if you go to the Nazi-occupied Ukraine, that will buy you a decent cup of tea or something.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'll stick to coffee for now.
Okay. The last thing, and this is not something that he got in Ukraine, but it was something that was sent to him. He had an uncle named Aaron, who was sort of a practical joker, as I recall. But when it became clear that my father was going to be spending the winter there, Uncle Aaron became somewhat concerned. And he knit my father an undergarment to protect parts of my father's anatomy that he thought were, you know, would be crucial to perpetuation of the family. So,
He did, right, Tom?
pardon?
We're glad he did.
Yeah. Anyway, this is my father's woolen penis and testicle warmer.
It is not in the book.
Knitted by his uncle Aaron. And I have no idea if he ever actually wore it when he was there, but he would pull that out. The last time I remember it was at his 70th birthday party, and one of the people there was a cousin of his who was the daughter of Uncle Aaron, and she hadn't known about it, but he pulled it out and he was showing it around. But anyway, so I was really familiar with his war experience, and it really almost permeated my childhood experience and was very much a part of my life. As I said, growing up, I had a nagging sense that his experience did not fit easily into the dominant American World War II narrative. And I guess, in a sense, that was confirmed when I recall him taking us to see The Longest Day. And there's a point in The Longest Day when somebody's asking, well, where's the Luftwaffe? And my father starts laughing and says, I know where they were. They were preparing to bomb us. So, ultimately, although he never said so explicitly, I think he had some of the same sense. The dominant narrative wasn't really where he fit in. I think I already mentioned the lack of any public acknowledgement in this country, and indeed, the World War II memorial built in D.C. in the early 2000s contains references to just about every campaign and battle in the dominant narrative. But when I visited, I could find no reference to either the Eastern Command or Frantic. On the other hand, there is a narrative into which his experience fits more easily, and I think he may have felt that way. And that's the Soviet narrative. When he spoke of the war, it was all about the incredible heroism of the defenders of Leningrad and Stalingrad, and the unbelievable sacrifices of the Soviets. He served in the same unit as Soviet soldiers, and my sense was that this, rather than the American narrative, was really his war. And the Russians apparently felt the same way. Unlike the US, which never recognized Frantic, the Russians in 1991 Miller and other participants in Frantic the 50th anniversary commemorative medal for participation in the Great Patriotic War. He was really tickled by that. It meant a great deal to him. And I think that really was the narrative into which his service fit most easily. Thank you.
If I could just take that copy of your book for a minute. When the editor at Oxford Press sent me proofs of his book, Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front, for an endorsement, I was astonished when I began to read the book in the very opening pages to find Frank Holzman. I mean, our own Frank Holzman, of whom I was so fond and with whom I had so many conversations over the course of decades, figuring so prominently in this book. I had not known about his wartime experience, had not known that he had served as a radar mechanic on the Soviet air base during the war in this campaign, which Tom Holzman has mentioned several times, was called Frantic. Just a huge surprise and a wonderful thing. Sergei has asked me to speak briefly about the book, about Frank, and about the Davis Center. But when you said Davis Center, I assume you must mean the old Russian Research Center. Yeah, the old Russian Research Center, which was really Frank's scholarly home for so many years, and in which he played such an important role. I love this book and greatly enjoyed composing an enthusiastic and not hyperbolic blurb for the jacket, for the back. As a fellow historian, I can assure you that many works of history address the kind of macro history that we find in this book, and others micro history that we find in this book, and others somewhere in between. This book is both macro on a vast and important scale, and micro on a scale of great detail. It's very unusual to find both woven seamlessly together in one book. I mean, they're usually the macro, the micro, or somewhere in between. So the origins of the breakdown of the Grand Alliance and the micro stories that you've just been hearing about of individual U.S. servicemen in Poltava and 2 other Ukrainian cities, their encounters with people in wartime Ukraine. I mean, it takes a Sergei Plokhine to pull off a neat trick like that, but he's actually pulled off a few neat tricks. I think I counted, this is his 13th book. This is my kind of book. I'm not a theory guy, and this book does not bore you with any kinds of theoretical constructs. It's committed to the telling of important stories. And not just an important story, but multiple important stories. The Grand Alliance, and within the Grand Alliance, we're used to reading about Hitler and Churchill and Roosevelt and so on. And here we have other people that are familiar, Molotov, Harriman, Cordell, Hull, and so many others. But then we are introduced to a whole host of middle-level people, who played such an important role in the establishment of these bases, figuring out, learning and seeing how politics actually worked during this period, American politics particularly. Characters such as Averil Harriman's daughter, who as a young woman proved to have commendable diplomatic skills and an ability to soothe Soviets and Americans from the very beginning, right? From the very beginning of this project. In short, buy this book. It's full of new details drawn from archival research about interactions in the highest level diplomacy, middle level politics, and the world of ordinary people, Americans, Ukrainians, and other Soviet people. The book is also highly relevant to today's sorry state of US-Russian relations. With all the finger pointing about who did what to whom, Crimea, sanctions, Syria, we could benefit from remembering the main argument of Serhi's book, that the Grand Alliance was, quote, doomed from within by conflict between Soviet and American political traditions and cultures. At first, Serhi, you said that you expected to find cultural misunderstandings, but you didn't find that much of it. But then you describe a lot of it in terms of, as you said, the political culture and values. And Serhi in this book shows again and again in crucial areas how different expectations led sometimes to camaraderie and sometimes to tragedy. The terrible story of the Pearl Harbor on the steppes had so many different elements. First of all, it was striking that of all dates, this bombing raid occurred on June 22nd, right? So it's the third anniversary of the invasion in 1941. And the Americans who had been in Britain had the experience, of course, of experiencing bombing raids. And they had expectations that if they're bombing raids at night, that the Soviets would be providing night fighters to defend against these German raids to protect them. But the Soviets did not. They had no radar-equipped night fighters. They couldn't provide it. And this proved fatal in the end, mostly actually to USSR military personnel and civilians when the base was bombed. This was this Luftwaffe raid that we saw both the photograph of the damaged plane and the piece of flak. And then the values differences. So, for example, in the aftermath, it was clear that the Soviets were expected to value, above all, saving the planes and saving other war materiel and weapons and so on, above saving human lives. And this clashed with US attitudes which put a premium on saving human lives. Then the expectation that the Soviets had, that they truly believed that those airmen who knew some Russian or came from emigre families had to be spies. I mean, it wouldn't occur to him that they wouldn't be spies. Of course, this led to increasing suspicions, and these people were not spies. They were there to promote success in the war effort. Superficially, it looked as though diplomatic relations on the high level between the great powers between the allies seemed firmer than the micro stories in Poltava and the other two air bases. I found very interesting the compelling story of the men at the air bases and how the Soviets viewed the Americans and the Americans viewed the Soviets. So For example, the U.S. Personnel were shocked at what they saw as deplorable sanitary standards. They, at some points, didn't want to eat in the kitchens, and in food produced in the kitchens at the base. They had seen, too many of the people who were preparing the food come out of the latrines without washing their hands. There was all kinds of, and the latrines, the latrines, one said that the latrines could be only called positively indescribable. They were just positively indescribable. Reminding me of the famous statement that Freud made in Civilization and Its Contents about soap as the measure of civilization. And then on the other hand, it was fascinating to read the Soviet attitudes toward the Americans. They saw the Americans, the American army, as being very lax in discipline. So, for example, in the Soviet camps, they had to make the beds, they had to be very neat, they had to keep everything in order, whereas the American soldiers just kind of kept their rooms or their bunks kind of messy and had things lying around, and they weren't, punished for it. And then the way they comported themselves with the officers and the men, that the men would speak to officers, with a cigarette dangling from their mouth, and just sort of talking to them informally as though these were normal conversations, whereas the Soviets had to stand at full attention and salute the entire time that they're being addressed by an officer. It was very difficult to understand. But of course, another point though that Serhii doesn't mention is envy. Envy can be a really bad thing. And the Americans had much better things, right, than the Soviets did. And there was, I think, well, first of all, there's a great deal of theft, which is a good way to deal with envy, right? So, but also envy of how the Americans were living, greater and greater suspicions when Americans would report, and say, my goodness, we live so much better than you do. And the Americans kept saying these things to people who they hadn't realized were SMERSH officers. And then there was the issue of the women. Serhii charmingly uses the verb dating. They dated, men were dating women. I'm not sure that's quite the word. Obviously, they were eager to socialize with women and to have sex with women. The Americans were absolutely flabbergasted to see so many Soviet women in uniform and doing everything. They were snipers, they were gunners, they were tank commanders, and there was a difference between I don't know what the female of fraternizing is, but anyway, fraternizing with the women in uniform and with the civilians. And the Soviets really complained about American fraternization with the women in uniform. And so the American officers told them that they really shouldn't do this. But they were unwilling to prevent them from dating civilians.
Fascinating love stories there.
Right.
Almost marriages.
Right, they're almost marriages. They were told they shouldn't do that. But one of the things that Serhii referred to that was really appalling to the American servicemen was that the women that they were dating, many of them, most of them, were either roughed up or interrogated or harassed, in some ways plagued by Soviet authorities, or told that they should be sort of put to use to get information and so on. So, but it got to a point where actually, as Serhii mentioned, fights broke out because when an American soldier was with a Russian woman and some plainclothes person or somebody in uniform went out and actually hit her, then the American would attack the Soviet, right? And fights would break out. So the details about these relations between U.S. men and Soviet women, both in uniform and civilians, are deliciously compelling. And in my blurb, I said that it tells of conflict, of the men's conflict with their Soviet male and female quote comrades in arms. And that brings me to Frank. My goodness, who would have thought of Frank Holtzman as a ladies' man? He had not one, not two, no three Russian girlfriends, Soviet girlfriends. Two of them were called Nina. To be fair, not all of these relationships were sexual, and I told you that Sergei obviously got all these details. But in one of the letters early letters that Frank wrote to his parents, Russian girls are too moral for your son. It's wonderful to read how he developed a fondness for Soviet people, even bonding with the USSR serviceman over their mutual interest in classical music. So now I just want to talk a little bit about Frank at the Russian Research Center. I literally first got an office at the Russian Research Center 50 years ago, so it has exactly been half a century when I was a student. And Frank was part of a coterie of Soviet economists, Abe Bergson from Harvard, Frank from Tufts, Leon Smolinski from BC, that Boston College, two Brandeis economists, Joe Berliner and Barney Schwalberg, who I hope is still alive. He would be the only one still alive. And the junior member of the group, Marshall Goldman, plus Lenny Kirsch, who taught in UMass Boston and very sadly died very young in 1977. Every Wednesday, they had their economists' lunches and would discuss all these questions of Soviet economics. Of the group, the most deeply and broadly cultured and by far the most eloquent was definitely Leon Smolinski, a diminutive Pole who was really quite brilliant and something of a Renaissance man. But the sharpest economist was definitely Frank Holtzman. Not only, that was not just my opinion, everybody knew that Frank was the sharpest of the economists. And it was also clear that he had that there were all these tensions with Marshall Goldman, I think, who maybe envied Frank more than a little in their discussions of CIA estimates of Soviet military spending, and it's telling that when I looked up the New York Times obituary for Frank, the obituary talked about a book that he published in 1985, Frank did, about the Soviet Union's turnover tax and how it redistributed money from low-income people to more highly paid ones, saying that this phenomenon ran counter to the basic dictates of the Soviet system. Quote, "It was a book I told him I wish I had written," said Marshall Goldman, Associate Director of the Davis Center for Russian Studies, where the two had been colleagues. It was good economics, it was good Sovietology. Usually at the time he wrote it, you did one or the other, but you didn't do both. Just a couple of words about Frank as a person. I was never invited to his home, so I never did get to see those photographs. I know Mark Kramer, who I guess isn't here, did go to Frank's home and did see the photographs. He was just a wonderful guy and very eager to help younger scholars. I was in a different discipline, in history, struggling with writing my thesis, writing my first book. He was always very supportive. I have to say, I think we spent a lot of our time talking about other people at the center. That's what it's like when you're in a community. But I also remember on a personal level, when I was thinking about whether or not to have a child rather late in life, he said, you must. Small children are such a joy. I'll never forget that expression. Small children are such a joy. And I said, well, what about when they get bigger? I said, do. So I applaud Serhi for writing this book, for focusing on differences in traditions and his values. But I do hope that he's wrong in one important thing. And that's the last sentence of the preface to his book, or at least it was so in the proof, which is what I took with me. I was just abroad, so it's lighter to take this than people. So he ends the preface with this: one obvious lesson to future generations is that partnerships can be sustained for some time by the need to defeat a common enemy, but no mutual trust and enduring relationship can be established between allies with incompatible visions of just political order and, at the end, of freedom and tyranny. This is too dark. It is too dark. I hope you're wrong. You're right about everything else. Thank you.
Well, thanks to our speakers. You've gotten three wonderful different perspectives on the book here. And we've got, I guess, a half hour or so that we can take some questions. While you're formulating your first question, maybe I'll ask a question to Serhi. You mentioned in your talk that the differences in political culture came to the fore by their experience of Soviet surveillance, amongst other things at the base. I was wondering if you could just say a word about how that surveillance worked and how much the Americans were conscious of being watched while they were there.
Well, we know exactly how it worked because we have the documents.
Uh-huh.
And so every unit would have SMERSH office, and they created a special unit to deal with the bases. So there was a unit there. They sent a special senior officer from Moscow to oversee that, and there was a relatively direct channel up there to the. It seems to me it was Abakumov, yes, the commander of the overall of that SMERSH unit. There were three different SMERSHs. That SMERSH was the biggest one. It was within the Red Army structure, and from Abakumov there was direct line to Stalin. So when there was the bomb raid, again, Stalin knew that more or less on the same day, and they dealt with that. There was also another emergency when the Soviet commanders on the base already in March, it seems to me, of 1945, misunderstood the signals and were preparing to attack the Americans. So that thing went there straight. And then they decided that they have increased the number of informers. So it was there, and get additional officers as well. But it was also interesting for me to see what did they want. And originally the idea was that, okay, limit and if possible cut altogether contacts with the outside world. So that was the main thing. And then look up for the spies, but don't get involved actively. Don't try to do that. But again, it looks like that Americans are dating women. If you see that can be used, you can use that. But again, not to be too aggressive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that was the beginning, and then once the Americans were not welcome there anymore, that's when troubles start, and they would, for example, accuse of this or that officer. Mostly it would be a Russian-speaking officer. They were suspected of being spies, of doing all sorts of bad things, and there is one, his last name was Zharov, originally from Odessa, lived in San Francisco area. they would actually complain on him, and he would be sent back to UK with the American commanders writing that, okay, to Air Force number 9 or 11 or something like that, Air Force number 8 doesn't want him. And it was only later that they realized that actually the Soviets were playing them. And for the big surprise came immediately after they started to attack the women who were on a date in the park, in the central park of Poltava. They were on a date. So when they were attacking those women, and then a lot of that information would go also when women later, in particular, would talk to their boyfriends that, okay, I was arrested, or that they wanted this or that, and that's when even the most hardcore kind of believers in the system, one of them was William Kaluta, who was very popular. His father came somewhere, in the Smersh documents he identified as Ukrainian. The father came from either northern Ukraine or southern Belarus, and was an activist in the workers' movement. So he was basically very on the left here in the US. And he came originally the Smersh rights. Okay, he says, okay, my father would not believe that I am here, that I am with you. I want to bring my sister here, and so on and so forth. Then, because he spoke Russian, those other officers basically asked him to help their girlfriends. And that was February, March. He basically, and he was the last historian of the base. So we have all of that. So a lot of that information was coming from the girlfriends, or basically when they realized what was happening with the officers, whom for no reason the Soviets suspected of being spies. We have this memoir that I mentioned of George Fisher, and George Fisher was in UK. He was the guy who was pre-selecting those people who, with the knowledge of Russian language and other languages, that would go there. And certainly George Fisher, growing up wanting to be Tukhachevsky, was really very good at actually weeding out anybody who would swag or anti-socialist or anti-communist. And then he writes in his memoirs, and I see what is happening. One after one, all my guys whom I pre-selected are being actually shipped back. And by the end of the summer, the top American command already realizes what is going on. So one of another characters in my book, Igor Reverdit, a very interesting guy who died only 2-3 years ago in California, and he was sent back after the complaint by the Soviets, but he got actually in the fight. They were pretty drunk, and he got in the fight and was shouting all sorts of anti-Soviet things. So they shipped him back and said that, okay, he will be reprimanded and so on and so forth. And I got in touch with his son, and they shared the letter which he left Poltava. So it was all impeccable record. The commander of the base just said that he was going back. He was a perfect officer. Everything was okay. So, but they figured out that already by the end of August, early September.
Questions for our panel? Yes, sir.
I had a question on the operational side. How many missions were actually flown by the B-17s? How effective were they? Where did these flights originate? How was the Poltava base supplied with bombs, spare parts, and other items?
Well, altogether, Tom in his presentation was kind of disclosed the secret of how the operation was codenamed. It was codenamed Frantic. And then they were given these different numbers, Frantic 1, Frantic 2, Frantic. So altogether there were more than 10. But they were of different nature. So the first one where they landed and where there was a lot of jubilation and happiness, they specifically wanted it, the targets was secondary. They really wanted it to be a success, to be a show thing. So other group of airplanes was bombing Germany somewhere else, distracting the Luftwaffe from them having a good ride, a good flight to Poltava. So the second, and it seems to me fourth, and a number of them were relatively successful, but they didn't know at the time. One of the raids that was considered to be just okay turned out to be a major success already after the war. They realized that they bombed by mistake. I don't know. I'm kidding, by mistake, but they bombed a factory that was building engines either for Tiger or for some tanks. So setting the whole that production of those tanks for half a year in time. So in that sense, it wasn't a minor thing. But the most important in terms of the expectations later and in terms of why the Americans continued that was a political importance. First of all, sending signals to the Germans that the Allies can fight together. And then they were, till the very end, were trying to persuade the Soviets to allow to open air bases in the Far East. That was the big issue. So for that, they were prepared to send every second officer back to Britain if the Soviets complained, because they wanted to keep the Soviets happy. Japan was the big thing, and eventually that didn't materialize.
My father very much wanted to be part of it to Siberia,
Right,
where they thought they were
And those were the rumors on the basis, and
Yeah.
those were the
He
expectations.
told me that he kept up good relations with one of the officers.
Specifically for that reason.
Specifically, so that he would get chosen if they opened up Siberian bases for shuttle bombing. Interesting, yeah.
I came a little late, so I apologize if you already touched on this, but I'm curious to know if any Ukrainian or Russian historians have looked into this, and if so, what have they said, and has that sort of differed from the narrative that you found or that you've written?
Thank you. Well, we had a discussion with Storm before the presentation, because I understand that him and his family, they put together all these wonderful letters and photographs together in response to a request that came from a Ukrainian scholar, Roman Podkor, who is working on the book dealing with the Operation Frantic. I was under the impression that that would be a research narrative type of a book, but I learned now that would.
Well, what Hiroaki told me was that they were putting together a book of documents on Frantic. And we put the materials together for Dr. Pudker because when they unearthed the KGB files, they found a 20-something, and one of them, which they were particularly interested in, half of it was devoted to my father and his visit to Poltava in 1958. I think he was the only one of them that ever went back.
Oh, George Fisher.
Did George go back?
Eventually
But,
went back as well.
You know, my father went back in '58. There's 100 pages of them following him, and
Well, do you want to say where he went, what he was looking for?
yeah, he basically, well, he went back to visit them, but what he was really looking for was to find his old girlfriend, Nina in particular. And he was, I mean, the people who were, the KGB guys who were tailing him thought that it was totally uninteresting that he was there. He was doing all the usual tourist stuff, and then he asked to be driven to a particular house. And he knocked, and there was nobody there, and he went into a courtyard, and the KGB guys weren't, they were at a distance. The only thing they could hear was the word Nina. And
They found her.
yeah, they tracked down not only her, but the one you saw in the photo. Yeah.
The younger Nina.
The younger.
But the other
Nina.
Nina.
Yeah, they found both of them and interviewed them, and you know, they were quite circumspect. about. The younger Nina said, you know, he didn't speak much Russian, I could barely communicate with him. That was her story. The other one, I think Sergei points out, the KGB had ordered her to stop seeing him.
That's the third one.
And he, indeed, she obeyed their order, and so they were satisfied that she hadn't, you know, gone off the
And
reservation.
it looks like that was also the one that he was looking for when he.
Yeah, that was
in 58,
undoubted, because the other one was from Mirgorod,
Yeah.
but, yeah, and he was looking for.
So-
Well, they gave Nina lots of champagne. Remember the New Year's Eve, we had a New Year's Eve party and we brought champagne and poured it
Two
chocolate.
bottles.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so in Ukraine there is a collection of documents published in the late 1990s when they were marking the 50th anniversary, and when from Russia the Red Army veterans were there from Ukraine, and there were three people from U.S., but there were also Air Force, a couple of airplanes, and Air Force personnel that served in the 1990s. In Russia, I don't have. There is no academic research, but there would be articles, and articles generally overall positive, celebrating the friendship and camaraderie in arms, and so on and so forth. There is an interesting research being done on the mostly British Lend-Lease salesmen who were in Arkhangelsk. There is a book coming up, and it's in my interview on the Huri website. The women who were dating the foreigners were treated very differently in Arkhangelsk and Poltava. In Arkhangelsk, quite few of them were actually not just arrested, but sentenced. And in Poltava, it was short arrests, the harassment, and so on and so forth, and we're just trying to figure out why they were treated differently.
Go ahead.
You mentioned that the airmen had turned. They came in with a more positive view and left rather negatively. What were the particular things that turned them?
Well, again, the best documented story is of this William Kaluta, right? Who also ended up to be a historian of the base, official historian of the base, and putting together the KGB materials and what he writes. So we see how super excited he is at the beginning. And then when he looks into the way how, again, it's about dating and how the SMERSH and the People's Commissariat for State Security was treating these women. So that for him is turning point. His is also the only story that a happy ending, the romance that ends in marriage.
Yeah.
But he married American woman nurse who was stationed there, and they took marriage in Poltava in April or in May of 1945, and then honeymoon was in Egypt. So they went for. Again, those are airmen. They can go anywhere.
Yeah.
So they went to Egypt. But another big thing was that the Soviets they were really trying to limit the number of flights to Poltava and from Poltava, and were playing all sorts of game, which was basically really pissing off the American airmen. They have to go here or there. Even before Yalta conference, they would try to stop them doing certain things. Okay, you need a permission, and permission can take 2 or 3 days, and they would lie to them why it is, and weather is not good, and they know that weather is good. So that is another thing. And then the fact that you just can't discuss any politics at all. the Soviets, speaking about genuine misunderstandings, the Soviets are really can't understand, there were elections in the US in 1944. How can you be for anybody but Franklin Roosevelt? So the guys who are against him and who don't like him for this and for that, Americans, they're speaking about that. The SMERSH agents are reporting there what is going on, who are those people. Of course, they have their own experience. If they would suggest that, okay, Kirov is better than Stalin or something like that, they know what would happen to them. So again, it's political culture, but it's then they just, and young generation of the Red Army soldiers, and again, they're pre-selected, they're true believers in this socialist communist system. It's, we have memoirs of some of them now and written already later, and he's writing, okay, there was no need to watch us because we were ideologically motivated. We were prepared to convince Americans that we are right.
I guess I'm struck and actually taken by the stories and the historic piece here, knowing your dad and having had him for course, but and your mom for a lot of courses, but more importantly, what I'd like to actually ask is the understory. And that understory has something to do with the role of intelligence, U.S. and Soviet intelligence, and the role of men and women. I can tell you, as someone who served with USAID and the U.S. being sent there for a clean air policy, that the work was not purely about the clean air, that we were helping with what was happening then with the split of Czechoslovakia and all of that. So, you know, let's be more honest. What I'd love to hear a little bit about, really, we're there about planes, we're there about war and strategic concerns, but we also had lots of other things going on, and I think there's more. We don't have time probably for all of it, but I'd love to hear from both the historic Ukrainian studies and what you unearthed from the KGB, and from Thomas, who may have heard stuff, because radar has something to do with all this. And maybe that didn't come out, maybe that's what.
Yeah, I'm not
never
sure I have any real insight into that.
Yeah, everybody kept secrets, or they didn't know.
But my editor was basically asking this question, saying,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, there is intelligence happening from counterintelligence from one side. What is the other part? And the Soviets suspected the Russian speakers, but also they suspected everyone who was working in the intelligence unit. And the intelligence unit was not the intelligence unit that the Soviets imagined themselves. Those were the guys who were debriefing the pilots when they landed, what they saw, so collecting intelligence on the targets that were. So the Americans are trying to play it extremely clean because they were on the charm offensive.
Yeah.
And again, there can be somewhere troves of documents that I'm unfamiliar with, and they would not be FBI, and they would be not in KGB, but whatever the military intelligence at that time was. But from what I know, that eventually that ended, and that's when FDR was really concerned about the POWs. And at that point, they shipped two people, it seems to me, really working actually. That's for the first time that the Soviets were suspected that the Americans were doing something illegally. So that's on the issue of POWs. There was kind of a special operation that was kept secret from the Soviets. Other than that, there were reports on, let's say, when already in the fall of '44, and it was just Poltava base that was left. One of the chapters in the book is called Watchtower. And they were not specifically on the intelligence mission, but they were when they were flying to Lviv and in Western Ukraine and areas in Eastern Ukraine, where the question was where the border would go, where the Poles would go, and where the Ukrainians would go. They were writing those reports on the situation in the cities, including in Lviv. So they were among the first, and you mentioned Sam Chapkin here. He wrote the longest expose on that. For example, the information about Holocaust and what Holocaust is. In my opinion, probably that was one of the first accounts on what happened that came to the military commanders, but it was also shipped to Avril Harriman in Moscow. What happened with that, I don't know. So, but that was kind of they were doing their job and they were reporting what they saw around, not specifically trying to engage them.
Yeah, my sense is that the American intelligence effort was more on the macro level. They weren't concerned about the particular people at the base, or whereas the Soviets were apparently, they were in the weeds, if you want. Interestingly, I don't think my father was ever aware of the extent to which they were in the weeds. Although I assume that all of the American soldiers assumed they were being watched. I'm sure my father assumed they were being watched, but not that they were being interfered with particularly. At least that his experience was that way. And a lot of the guys really liked, they had very strong feelings. There were several that my father told me about who wanted to marry their local girlfriend, renounce their American citizenship, settle in Poltava, and live the rest of their lives. And what my father said was that there were a couple of them that really refused to leave when they were supposed to be flown out, and that they had to be tied up and carried onto the plane. That was how strongly a lot of the guys felt that way.
There is a chapter that didn't go into the book that describes one of the stories when, again, marriage didn't happen, but they were corresponding. The U.S. Officer was sending visas and all other things that women would go to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. They would smuggle her from the embassy so that she wouldn't get in trouble. And it didn't end in the book because this is a character that otherwise is not present in the book. And I tried to follow some of the stories, and your father's was one of them. And there was a guy from New York who just popped up, in particular in that context already, of the correspondence after 1945. So it's a separate, it's a chapter that is written but is not published.
Had the German presence in Crimea been completely subdued at this point?
Again, it's the bases are there. They start in late April *44. They continue this military operations until late September of 1944, and you can look at the map. I'm not sure what is happening in the Crimea, but it seems to me Crimea is already Soviet at that time. The main, and this map is from early 44, so Crimea is still marked as German. But it seems to me by April, May, that's when the bases start, and that's where the Crimea was retaken. By the time of the Yalta Conference, of course, the main concern is the flag coming from the American, from the German anti-aircraft gunners in the Mediterranean on the islands.
Okay. over Yugoslavia.
So it's the bases were opened more or less around the time when the Crimea was overtaken.
I was wondering if any comparisons could be drawn between the story that you tell and the experience of the French Normandy Nieven squadron, which was also stationed on the Eastern Front.
Well, I specifically looked at the relationship between the Americans and the locals, and again, the question of Dayton was a big one, so I looked at that. Again, I didn't do my own research, but I read whatever I could read. And Nina was talking about envy, and envy was there. Nobody, I mean nobody, when I say nobody, the local man, either the British or the French didn't like Americans. They were richer, they had more supplies, so it was very difficult to compete with them when it comes to women. So the Americans were stationed in UK, so the divorce rate was extremely high, and the divorce was the guys who were serving in the British Army. The numbers, it seems to be hundreds of thousands. It is in the book, but I don't remember exactly. And in French, there was a big question about, which is closer to Ukraine in a sense that, okay, if these are the women who were dating Americans and now were dating Germans and now Americans, so it's an insult to France and to the dignity and national pride and so on and so forth. So basically, one foreign army and now another foreign army. And that story was present in Ukraine because normally when the American officers complained, the counterintelligence explained actually they're prostitutes. They were dating Germans, and by the way, they have also all sorts of diseases, and we're here to protect you. So that was the line. So that's why we are stopping all this contacts. So from that point of view, again, there are some parallels with Britain, more parallels with French. What makes it completely different, and Nina was talking about that is actually state is getting involved into that, and state regulates that, and in particular secret police. And that's what we don't see in France, that's what we don't see in France, that's what we don't see in Britain. So, but yeah, foreign army on anybody's territory, especially the army well supplied, and in terms of the pocket money, having more than the other side, it's always a problem. In Ukraine, they also had kind of a reverse problem in a sense that the idea was, it was decided somewhere in the army headquarters that they didn't need money in the place like the Soviet Union anyway. So most of their salaries was sent to the deposit accounts. So they were getting only part of it. And then the Soviets specifically to limit the number of the contacts with the local population opened the restaurants on the base. So whatever money you have, you spend on the base. You need alcohol, it is on the base. You don't have to go to the city. They still were going to the cities. Then it turned out that the Americans were outgunned by the Soviets, who had Soviet officers in particular, who had their salaries. And those were really, the Americans didn't have enough money. That's where the theft started also, in a sense that the Americans were actually selling their own supplies. And that's where feds were coming from. And so basically, what was there was some embroidery. I understand that your father has embroidery. There was the photo cameras and other things. And that was coming either from your salary or from exchanging army supplies, either for goods or for services or whatever it was. And in terms of, again, dating and relationship, the Soviets are saying, okay, look, there is this stockings or this and that woman had, and that it was from the American boyfriend, and nice clothing or something like that, nice by the standards of Poltava of 1944. That what that meant. So that material part was there.
Great. I think we've come to the end of our time, and I'd like to thank all of our speakers and invite you to give them a round of applause.